Thank you. Yeah, my name's Jeff Maxwell. I appreciate everybody coming today. We're going to talk through some Angular 5 and some different parts of Angular. If you haven't had an opportunity, I'd recommend you go back and watch Megan and Patrick's presentations over the last 2 weeks. Megan did a really good job on an overview, kind of the intro to Angular, and Patrick did an excellent job last week on routing. And I'm taking a lot of the examples that he had ended with, and we're going to continue on there. So I appreciate him doing the legwork for me on that. Kind of the agenda today, we're going to talk about some of the changes between Angular and Angular 2 or AngularJS 1.x, however you want to say it, and the new version. Talk about classes, components, modules, services, and performance. Hopefully we'll be able to get through everything. We'll have to skip some stuff, won't be able to go into a deep dive on everything, but hopefully give you a little bit of an overview and kind of a touch point so you can jump off from there. So some of the changes, Angular, real brief history, came out. It's now called AngularJS. Came out approximately 2009, 2010, supported by Google, written by Google, maintained by Google. Currently, the last version they had was 1.6. It released February of this year. They actually came out with some patches. They're continuing to patch what they call the legacy AngularJS. For those of you who have done both, great. You kind of know the pain points there. For those of you who are starting out, don't look at the old stuff. Look at the new stuff. That's what Google definitely wants you to do. So your life will be much easier. Kind of Angular 2. Hadn't been around that long. It was originally discussed around 2015, later released in 2016, the first full, released supported version. So about 2 years. Somewhere in there, I got in around 2017. There's a big mystery. What happened to Angular 3? They went from Angular 2 to Angular 4. Angular 3 must have been such a terrible release that they didn't even make the light of day. So they went to Angular 4 last spring, and Angular 5 came out this last November. If they keep up with that cadence, you may or may not see another Angular version, Angular 6. I guess they're going major versions every year now, or twice a year. So we'll see how they continue with the naming. The examples I'm doing today is in Angular 5, so I'll explain some of those differences. Like I said before, Patrick did a great job last week in routing. So I took his project. He did an example of a Game of Thrones search engine, which is really nice. And a couple things I did is I went ahead and upgraded from Angular 4.2 to Angular 5.2, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But like I said, all the examples, where we're starting is where Patrick ended up last week. So he did all the routing and setup, and we're taking that and kind of moving forward with that a little bit. I want to talk about classes real quick. In TypeScript, you have the ability of creating a class. And so don't worry too much on the left side there. Let me see if I can pull this up. I almost touched my screen, which is not a Mac thing. Come on, there we go. So I'll see if I can increase the size of this. This is Postman, and the APIs that we were using last week is api.got.show, and this returns one character, and you can see the data here, the ID, the name, all that kind of stuff. If you take this information right here, and you're looking at object-oriented type of programming, you would probably make this a class. In JavaScript, you have, and in Angular 2+, 4, 5, whatever you want to call it, you have the ability of an any type. So I can take any data and throw it in an any type. But then you don't get some of the advantages of TypeScript. Namely, if I have an integer value, if I have a number value or a date or those type of things, if I bring it as an any type, it's basically a string, right? It won't have any type validation. So what you can do, and I'll show you real quick here, let me pull up this component. So I have a person class that I've created, and this characters.person array I'll actually go to the detail screen. So this is one person here, I have selected person. Now I can do something like selected person dot, and now I have all of the values for that. So before I wouldn't have those because I would have it as an any type. Now if I define it as an actual person, I have this validation. And so if male is, it's a true false value. If I say male equals 5, that's going to give me an error. What's the error? It's saying I can't convert 5 into a Boolean, right? So that's some of the advantage of making things a class and implementing classes and passing those around instead of. It's really not like a compiled language necessarily like C# or Java. You're still going to have the error. The TypeScript won't let you build this because of that error, but it's kind of after the fact. And so that's what's nice about the TypeScript range. So if I do true or false, if I can spell, that'll actually get rid of that error. So that's one of the reasons why you would use a class. So the first thing that I did to change it was I added this person class. Pretty straightforward class. You export class, give it a name, person, people, person. People is our list of people, and then we have each person. I almost did people and peoples, but that was really going to be confusing. So I went with this, and you can see you can define each type. You can do a number, you can do a date, string, and these with the brackets, that's basically array of strings. So books, there can be multiple books. If you look back at the return type here, this person, Jon Snow, was in all of these different books. So it's an array of those strings. So the nice thing about using a class is you're going to be able to have, you know, a little bit more type safe once you're compiling and running these apps. It'll say, oh, you know, you're trying to assign, if I'd made that an any, it would have said, oh, great, you're trying to do a 5 and a true false. I'll let you figure out that that's going to be a problem later. Okay? So that's really the brief overview on class. And at any time, go ahead and shout, and if you have a question, I'll try to stop and answer your question. Let's talk a little bit about components. So both Megan and Patrick did a good job of reviewing on components. You can, from the Angular CLI, you can create a component by doing an ng-generate component and give it a name, or the shorthand is ng-gc, give it a name. So I created a people card component. I'll show you why here in a minute. What that does, it creates 4 different files. Let's take a look at those files. When I first run that, it actually, and I did a little bit different. So it creates a folder here for me called people card, and it creates a CSS file, an HTML file, a testing spec file, and the component. The component itself, it, you know, like the other components, it has what is the name of it. So if I do app-people-card, I can use that anywhere in my app. Gives it a name, and I'll talk about this input here in a minute. Same with the HTML. Really all I did, and let me show you what this output looks like. Very similar to what Patrick had. I just put them in HTML bootstrap cards. Just put them in a little card, made a little click on the details, but that's really it. Why do we want to break down these components? One nice thing about Angular is instead of having one massive file, you can break them down into components. So what I felt like, instead of having the HTML that we had before, which was in the people component here, this was the original HTML. Not a whole lot, but now I changed it to just this. App-people-card. So now that's all self-contained. It can have its own programming behind it in TypeScript. It has its own programming file or TypeScript file, has its own HTML, has its own style. So now I can componentize that. Same loop that we had before, where I'm looping through, left the character of characters. But you'll see as I'm passing in an input here, I'm saying, okay, I'm going to pass in the variable character into an object called person, right? So that gets defined here in my card class as this input. You have to import it, so I import the input from Angular Core, but then I can say input person, and I can type it as a person. So what now this card allows me to do is I can have it in a loop, I can have it by itself, and all I have to do is pass in a person object of a person type, and it'll display. It'll display that little card for me. The HTML, it's very similar to what it was before. Oops, wrong one. Up here. It's person name, person house, the person detail, the link, the image, their photo, very similar to the image link, very similar to what it was before, but now I have a self-contained component that I can reuse. Kind of an arbitrary example, but it kind of gives you a little bit of an idea of what you can or cannot do with that. That allows you to, for big applications, you can start breaking them down into smaller components or reusable components. A lot of times the rule of thumb I use is I won't create a component until I need it in 2 places. And then I'll create a component because now I don't want to, well, I used to, and I still do probably, cut and paste a lot. So instead of cut and pasting, I'll go ahead and create another component and then include that. Okay? Yes, sir.
Do you use your static analysis when you're doing like a string for an HTML attribute? So like on that, for that anchor tag where it says router link, if you do the dot after person dot underscore ID, is it still gonna line? Is that still gonna autofill that for you?
So here.
Yeah. So like where it says person dot ID.
Okay.
So like if you were to just put gibberish there or something.
Yeah. Well, let's see. Dot. Save that. Yeah, so it compiled it. So because that's a string, I'm doing a router link string. Probably a better method there would be to go ahead and call an action in your TypeScript to do that instead of a link. Or have a function that returns the value of that link. So that's a good call. But if I do this, dot gibberish, and compile, well, it didn't build on me, but probably if I rebuilt it, let's see here. You can do ng build. Let's see if he crashes on me. No. Now let's see if it catches it here. Oh well, I got to run it. And if I look at the behind the scenes output, console, yeah, so it's catching it over here. So at least catches it, yeah, I can't read that property. So a little bit of a help there. Sometime you can see that it didn't really return what we were expecting.
I don't think it'll build either. I think it gets common build as well.
Yeah, seemed like it built for me, but we'll see. We can go back and play around with that. So the question was, if I mess around with the inputs or the names, will it catch it? And there's a couple different ways. Sometimes when it runs, sometimes when it compiles, it'll catch those type of things. So if I, type in something really bad, you can't find that person, you hope that it goes and find that, but it didn't. So we'll see what I'm doing here. So next, and that's kind of what we talked about. Let's review that real quick. This is passing information to a child component. I have a component which was the people component. Sorry, the people component here, and I'm passing that data into that child. The way you do that, you have your object, and I actually changed that. I was playing around with the app. That's going to be app and app. Sorry. You pass in that object or component that you had, and then you have that input. So that's really the nice way of doing it. And it makes it pretty easy. I can pass an entire object of type safe object into that, and then it'll work pretty easily, okay? So let's talk a little bit about services. So the main HTTP service we're using here, from what Patrick gave us last week, was something I really like and I've been playing way too much with this week. API got show. So they have an entire API for the Game of Thrones where you can pass in all the information. You can get the characters, you can get locations, you can get story plots, you can get about anything you want, and it passes in. So if I want a character, I can get all the characters. This is the API call I make. Throw that into Postman, and it's going to give me a ton of JavaScript back, or JSON back, sorry. So I have all of this now that we can play around with, okay? So you want to put that in a service. So why would we break up? You could make this call to this API directly from your component, right? Why would we put it in a service instead of calling it directly from a component? The main reason I create a service is, once again, if I'm going to use it in multiple places. I may want to get the characters from multiple screens, or I want to get that, a specific character, or just to have the separation of concerns, right? I'm breaking up my components that are connecting and wiring up my HTML to my back-end services, the services that I'm calling to get that data. So let's take a look at that. I created a people service, and I'll tell you here in a minute why it's in the same folder. But let me minimize that a little bit. So created a service. You first have to, you see the decoration here, it has to be injectable. And when we look back at the component, what happens is you build a service, and then for dependency injection, I'm injecting that into my component so it can be available and used in the constructor. So we'll take a look at that. One of the differences, I'm using HTTP client instead of HTTP. In 4.3, let's see if I have that doc. Yeah. In 4.3, there was a change that you can still use HTTP, which is fine, but in HTTP client, it adds some additional features. One of them is I don't have to pass in and route to JSON, map it to a JSON. By default, it's JSON now. So it returns as JSON. Before, you had to say map the result from JSON back into. So it's really add client in front of everything, don't map JSON, and everything else works the same, okay? The other two things that it does is interceptors and progress events. We'll talk briefly about those. So it's really kind of a superset. It has all the same features that your current HTTP does. They added HTTP client. Everything should work the same. It was kind of a breaking change because it's not required to pass in for JSON anymore. That's why they added HTTP client. The other difference is it's out of the common, it's Angular common HTTP instead of Angular HTTP, okay? So those are two of the things they have. Let's talk, so back at the code. So I'm doing HTTP client. Here's the base URL. Here's that api.got.show. And I'm doing get characters. I've changed it from an observable of any to observable person, right? I want to return this and map this into the person object so that I know for a fact it is a person, and I can manipulate it those ways. I can run through and run totals or counts on how many true falses there are. I can filter on trues and false. There's different things I can do with the types instead of returning it as an any and everything's a string. Okay. The other change is to this is this right here, where I'm casting that return from that API into a person, right? So that I can return that observable. Observable, you have a little bit, and we'll talk a little bit differences between observable and promises. If you are familiar with Angular 1X, you probably were using promises so that you would send out a request, and then that request will promise to return at some point, right, and give you some values, so you're kind of waiting for that. So we'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. But both of these, I have the get characters, returns everything, and then get character by number. This one is doing a person array. This one's doing a person. So I brought those both into a class called person service. Or sorry, into a service called person service. Okay? Now on our component side, let's say on the component here, the changes I made here, instead of characters of an any array, it's a characters of person now. And in the constructor, I'm injecting person service instead of API service. Okay. We'll come back to why I changed. Patrick had originally created a shared service called API service that I've also changed to return people instead of any. This one, city, this is what it was doing before, is any. So now that we have that, we can subscribe to that call. And subscriptions are, everything's async calls. You know, I make a call, I don't know how long that call is going to take. In this instance, it returns 2,000 different characters, right, back to me. So that may take a long time. Sometimes they may take a short time. So you can't just call it and then keep on moving on, because what your code will do is it'll make that call and keep going, and then it never waits for that return. So you have to subscribe to that call and say, once you get something back, then tell me, and then I'll take the next action, right? So subscribe takes 3 parameters. The first parameter is the result. I'm going to take the characters that are returned, and I'm going to be expecting a person array. I'm going to be expecting a person array, and then I'm going to map the local variable, this characters, for the value characters that were turned in. If I want to do something else, you can do multiple things. I would just simply add it like this. And then I can also say, you know, console log hello. Okay. Yes, I know it wants single ticks, but I've been typing double ticks for so long. Okay. That wasn't an error, that was a suggestion. So now I can do multiple things. So this is before this comma, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to get a character return. I can take actions. In this case, I'm now typing out hello, and I'm also saying this characters. If I go back to, hopefully that reloaded, there's that hello. Okay. The second parameter is the error, if any. Error, and I'm returning as an any type. You can actually map this to an HTTP error class and do more manipulation with it. Same kind of thing is I can have one line, but if I want multiple lines, I just wrap it in the curly braces, and I can now have multiple lines of that error, do multiple things. Okay, so that's the first 2 steps. And then this is the completion. After it's completed, then I can do something else. So once again, I can, if I want this to be multiple lines, if it's inline now, but if I want it to be multiple lines, I can simply wrap it in curly braces and do that. It looks a little confusing and ugly, and it is. But just think of when every time you subscribe, you have 3 options. You're always probably going to do the first option, right? I'm making a call, I'm going to get some data back, in this case. Even if I'm posting some data, I'm going to get a success or failure, right? My service should tell me, yes, that you successfully saved the document or file. I always probably want to catch an error, because otherwise, if I don't catch it, it goes out and doesn't ever report to anybody, and just people are like, it doesn't work, you don't know why. Right, so you probably want to catch that and do some type of logging. And then that complete step is if there's other things you want to do. So if you wanted to pop up and say, you know, all the data's been loaded, or thanks for submitting your form or some type of notification, you can do it in that last step. And you see I'm saying characters retrieved, and then I'm saying characters, which was defined here, the length. So if we look back at the code that or the output, that's this output right here. 2,028 characters were retrieved, right? So that gets run after it's been completed. Everything's run successfully, okay? That's probably the deepest part that we're talking about today, is services and calls back and forth. But like I said, you can simplify it by worrying about these first two sections of what's getting returned. But just remember, anytime I'm making a call that's an asynchronous call to a backend or to your own backend or some service, I need to subscribe to that, and so it waits for the results, okay? Another thing that is different is interceptors, which I'll come back to in a second, and then progress events. So this is a pretty big update and call, so I wrote a little function here called get data progress, right? Down here, all it's doing is it's calling to the API service, get data progress. So let's run that real quick and look at the output, and then we'll come and talk about it. So what it's doing is it's saying download in progress 664K of 651, and then it does the complete and says done afterwards. At my house, where the internet is not near as good, I get a lot more output there, right? So what you're doing is you're getting progress updates during that download or upload or the time your data is sent. There's lots of things you can now track with the event processing and progress. So if you're downloading a big file or uploading a big file, you could give status updates along the way. So let's take a look at how that's done. And I'm probably going to be, this is kind of ugly, isn't it? Let's look at that in the code. May not be as ugly or worse. So here's the function, get progress. I'm creating an object, a request object of type HTTP request, which I'm importing up here, HTTP request. And then I'm setting, it's going to be a get call. So if you've watched some of the presentations that other people have done, there's all kinds of different verbs that you can do on a web page. It's get, post, put, delete, those type of actions. I'm giving it a base URL, which I defined up here. And then I'm saying report progress equals true. All right, so I'm turning on saying give me updates along the way. Now I'm basically making that call and doing the subscribe, and I'm saying, okay, if it comes back, this event type, when it comes back, I want to check in a switch statement. You could do if-thens, but if you have a lot of different steps that you can easily define, it's probably better to do a switch, where I can say, if it was sent, then say request sent. If I look over here, you see request sent. And then you can say response header received, response header received, see that in there, and then download progress. So I didn't do the upload, but you could do the same thing. But what I'm doing is I'm taking, anytime it makes that call back and gives me an update, I'm taking how many bytes I'm looking for divided by how many you've sent me to do that total bytes, right? Divide by 1,024 and just saying download in progress, and it did it in 2 steps. Download 64K and then download the rest of the object, okay? So that's, and then at the end, after response is done, you get a response type, and then I can just say done, right? So this was a nice feature that they added, especially if you're dealing with large payloads. It's because a lot of people will sit there and say, refresh, refresh, refresh. Your page isn't working because it's taking 10 seconds. Now, if it's a large payload or a large download, you can give them a progress along the way, okay? The last one is an interceptor. Yes, sir?
How often does that update?
It's up to the API call. Like I said, at home, it gave me like 10, which tells me how terrible my internet is at home. It gave me 10 updates, right? So it's really how many times it calls and can send back in a given period of time. It's not a set period of time, right? Yes, sir?
Without a default, are you worried about getting hung up in this?
Without a default?
Yeah, the switch, and see often I need to put a default at the end of all the cases, so that if it was none of those cases, it would still break out.
Yeah, you can catch an error, other default types. The last default is basically the response. So that's going to be the last message that is sent, was the response from the object, right? So when you get everything, once it's done, it'll send that last response, even if there's an error. So the question was, what about a default? You know, don't have a default value set in the switch. What happens if there's a problem? And so even if there's an error, the response will have that error. It's a good question. So the last piece I'm going to talk about on the updates to HTTP client is interceptors. This is an interesting thing, and it really helps for making the same call. So you can create an interceptor, and it's a little different on things. So I created an API interceptor, put it in the shared folder, and basically what it does is it'll intercept that HTTP traffic, and then you can do something with it. What I use it for in my day-to-day work is authentication, right? I don't want to have to program every single call out to the database and include all of my authentication, my tokens, and all of that. So what I'll do is, once I've authenticated, I'll store that token, and then this interceptor, I'll send that token every time. So I'll tack on that token every time. What I'm doing here is pretty simple, just for demonstration purposes. So I'm bringing in you make a class, you implement the HTTP interceptor. You have to create one function there, intercept. It takes in a request. I'm also taking in a next handler. So what will happen is the interceptor's called, I do what I need to do, and then I call the next function, right? I call the next thing. It returns observable of any type, and I'm just saying intercepted, and I'm passing whatever the request came in, I'm passing that request back out, right? And then I'm calling this next to move it to the next step, to either call that HTTP call or what the next thing's going to happen. So if we look at what call was made here, it says intercepted, and so you can see one call that characters, here was the header that was passed, here's all the parameters that were passed, so you can see I caught it, I just dumped it out, and then it went ahead and made the next call, which actually got the data, okay? So when you're looking at doing authentication, this is the way I'd recommend you do the authentication, so that you're passing this token or doing those type of things. Or if you want to log every time something's called, you know, I don't know that you wouldn't do that on their own server, but say you don't know how often this Game of Thrones, you know, app is called. Maybe I want to know. So I'm keeping track of how many calls for this one or that one.
Can you zoom in on that?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so intercepted, and then here's the request. So, like I said, probably most used in authentication, okay? So those are the three different types, and I know that's kind of a lot. I mean, quite a lot. To add a service, same kind of thing. I can run from a command line, generate surface, people, add it to that module. Whoops. Let's talk about observables. So difference between observables and promises. If you've used Angular 1X, you know, observable can handle multiple values over time, right? I can send it multiple things. I can have retries. There's lots of different things I can do with observable. A promise really just is called once and returns one object. Also, observables can be canceled. So I can, if I had a huge payload, this is probably going to happen faster than I could cancel it, but we could have a call and cancel button in there so it would cancel that request before it was finished, right? Promises weren't that way. You're going to get it or you won't. It was either going to error out or not, right? So that's where you would look in your stack and it would have all this data dumped and you would never see, oh, this one errored out 3 minutes after I left the page or I moved on. This is on the subscribe. We already talked about that, the 3 different sections. So let's talk about modules. So after you've built quite a bit of code, it starts getting really messy, right? I've got all these folders everywhere. I've been working on this people object for a long time for Game of Thrones, and I've got every single option you could think of, right? I've got their storylines, I've got their plots, I've got components everywhere. I've got 50 different components and all these calls. At that point is one of the good options of doing a module, right? We already have one module in the application, right? Whenever the application starts, the first thing it calls is this module, right? And we are also using we're using the browser module, the forms module, we're now using the HTTP client module, NG module, and all of those are defined, route module, all those are defined down here in imports. You're importing that information, and declarations and those type of things. So what I want to do is I want to create a people module, and we'll come back and see the changes here in a sec. So I want to create a people module, if I can find it. All right. So it's going to have everything I need to contain information about people. I can have components, I can have services, I can have other call, I have classes, I can have those type of things in my component, right? I want people to be self-contained, right? I do this a lot in larger applications where I have different sections of the application and I want to completely contain that section, right? And there's some performance reasons why, and we'll get that hopefully here in a minute. So it's very similar to our app module. I'm defining the common module, forms module. I'm doing routing. What did I just do? Oh. I'm doing the routing here. So one thing you'll notice on the difference in routing is I'm routing the module for child. And when Patrick was showing us, he was routing the module for the root, right? So now a module can even have its own routing and path, and you probably want that so that you don't have in your app module this huge list of all these routes, right? I want my people to have specific routes. But I do have to communicate from the app module to the people module that initial route, right? So that's what this is. That's what this line is. Hopefully you can see that. But I'm saying the path is going to be people, and then I'm going to say load children, and I'm going to give it a path to my people module, app/people/people module, people.module. And then it's saying, you can maybe or may not see that, there's the number sign here, the pound sign, and then people module. So if I jump over to this, here is the name of it, people module, okay? So now in the people module, I'm bringing in the different components. I have my own route, and I'm saying children. So what that's going to do is it's going to say, okay, now I'm going to look for a path that's people/list or people/detail/some ID, right? So it's getting people from the root here, and then from the child, it's going to pass that down. So now I can have a self-contained module and application that's doing the same thing that it was before, but now I'm putting it in its own module, okay? That's also why I did the people service, right? In my world, the people stuff's all contained in the people, and the cities aren't going to call the people and that kind of thing. So I'm keeping the people separate. So I created their own service, the people service, right? So I don't have to junk up an API service, right? So it's self-contained. Maybe a bad idea if you're going to use it other places, but in this world, I just want someone to say, I want the people module, go. They get the components and they get the services. Okay? So you can also see I'm defining the people component, people detail, the people card, which is the new one I did, and I also am passing the spinner component, right? That's that little spin when you do that search at the beginning. I'll see if I haven't killed the app yet. I'm good at killing it during demos. Refresh. Yeah, that little spinner, okay? So I'm passing that component in also for it to be used. Okay? So that's how that works. Now, one thing about the module is now that I've created that and separated everything out, what do I do in the app module to see that? And I kind of left the code in there so you can see both. So if you're back here in the app module, I've commented out. Now I don't have to pass in the app module. I don't need the people component, the detail, card, or service anymore. And I can take those paths out. These were what the original paths were. I can take those out of the declarations. I can take the spinner component, the service. I can take all of those out. And all I have to have is people module here. So that's all I need now to do all of that other stuff, right? So that's why I do it a lot. Like I said, in bigger applications, if I have a users section for, say I have a user admin section of my application where you can add users, remove users, do all that. It's kind of self-contained in a lot of ways. So I'll put that as a user module, and I can take that code and package it up and give other people that whole module, right? And they can just drop it in, okay? Any questions on modules? I know that's kind of a lot too, sorry. So, with a little bit of time that we have left, let's talk a little bit about performance. So I don't know if you've ever noticed, so right now, let's see how I was running this. I think I did just an ng, well, I'll just do it again. Just ng serve, right? Runs my app, if I didn't break it. Okay? Runs the app. Here it is. It's loading that. And if I go to the home page, which I added a home page link here, and go to the .NET tools, I'll go over to the network traffic, and I'm on the Mac, I do Shift Control Reset. This will clear any cache and re-download everything, all the pages. And if you notice down here, it's 10.4 meg. That's a huge page, right? In internet anymore, we get, we're so spoiled by high speed that it's like, 10 meg, that's nothing. That's a huge web page, especially if you're on your phone, right? And why wouldn't I want my Game of Thrones app on my phone? I definitely want my Game of Thrones app on my phone. So how can we clean this up? Well, this is kind of in the debug mode, right? The Angular CLI, you're running in debug mode. So what are some of the things we can do to clean that up a little bit? One is to do an ng build or do the ng open or ng serve with a prod. So the difference is if I, right now, let's see, AL, right now, I don't have a DIST folder. Well, it says I do. Oh, there it is. So I'm going to rebuild it. I'm going to say ng build. What this will do is this is going to build it and compile it and kind of rerun it for me. And the other way I can do it is I can do ng serve prod. And what's behind the scenes is using something called Webpack. And it tells you, please don't do this in production. This is just for your build output. Don't run ng serve on a server out in the wild. You just take the output. So what it's going to do is it's going to create these files here. Let me clean up some of this. Don't. So it's going to build that and run it. And what it's running is this output. And now if I go back to my page, Same page. Shift Control reset. Now it's 635K, right? So it packaged those things up. It made a lot smaller package and information for us and put it in a folder called DIST. So if I go to that, oh, I got to build it again. When you do the prod, it just does it in the build. If I build it, it'll create that output folder for me. It'll be a lot smaller. Does all the compression, minification, groups it all together for me. And if I look at that folder and do it shows the sizes here. So they're a lot smaller, right? My vendor file, my bundles, those type of things. So it takes all of your vendor files, like your Angular files, puts that all together in a JavaScript file. It takes all of your CSS, takes everything and kind of packages it all together for you. So it gives you a lot smaller package. You'll also notice there's a map file. If you use, you can use source map. So if I do an ng build prod source map equals true, let me try that real quick. Go back. ng build prod source maps true. Hopefully rebuild all of this. I may have to delete that folder, we'll see. And so it's going to create those files, recreate those source maps for me, and then I can run a utility to see where the biggest files are, or biggest libraries in that file. Maybe. There you go. And what you'll see here is, let me do that, can't talk and type, sorry. You'll see that these are pretty weird names. That's for caching, right? If I deploy a new version, those all change, those numbers, those strings change. Everything after main, this right here, main blah, 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 dot bundle, that's all going to change. So the next time someone downloads your app, it won't have that file cached, so it'll bring down that new file, right? So that's a good thing. But now that I have these map files, I can do source map explorer. And if you don't have this, you can install this from npm. And then I'll give it a main.js. And what that does, and this is really hard to see because it's pretty large, but it gives you kind of a heat map of where your largest bundles files are, right? And things like, now I have, RSJX, which is used for the observables and those type of things. So you want to be careful and make sure you're only including the things that you need, right? Instead of, so an example, I'm already doing it, but an example would be here in the service call, to get the observable, I'm saying RxJS observable. I could also do Rx, right? Which gives me the whole library, which would increase the size of that. So that's one thing about Angular to take note of, is you want to find the specific things you need. If you need a map function, or if I need a particular function, just go ahead and import that specific function that you need instead of the whole library, right? To try to keep the bundle size of your files down. Okay? So, one more thing on that. Serve, I'll run this in prod again. So before, when we had this page. Let me go back to the home, get rid of that. Back here on the site. Come on. Okay, it's building that out for me. Now, if I go to this page, let me reload. Reloads everything. It's 635. Go to the people page. And what I want to load is right here. Now it's loading a lot of images. So I'm just going to say, it's calling the characters and then JavaScript. It actually called this inline bundle here. Like, well, why did it call more JavaScript? And if searching through here, and it's got some of the, well, trying to find, it's kind of ugly, but what is that extra file? That's that module. Because we said we want to load the module when it's used, it's going to send that additional JavaScript down later, right? So it's sending just that chunk of data down later. It's this chunk here. It says chunk in it. Makes it a lot easier, right? So it's only, yeah, there you go. There's the list and the detail. So it's only sending that bit of code later. So if you have a massive file, a massive project, this is kind of one way of reducing that initial load up front, is coming back in here like what we did and having those components loaded as a part of that module. So doing this line right here and having that module, it's only going to send down the necessary JavaScript when we go to that route, right? So if I have, hundreds of different pages and all of that, that's going to save me a lot of time over time. It's lazy loading. It's only going to send what's needed, okay? So that's the real quick of it. I have a few minutes for questions. I know we've got some wrap up. I know that it's kind of a whirlwind. Feel free to get a hold of me. I'll publish all of this tonight out there. Jeff at tcnsolutions.com or jeffmaxwell.com. You can get a hold of me. Go ahead.
Can you explain interceptors again real quick?
Yeah, so Interceptor is going to be called on every HTTP request. So every time something you're making a request out, this interceptor is going to say, I want you to call me first, right? So I can do something. And like I said, what you typically would do is I have a web page, I've got some secure site pages, and I have others. I log in. Typically, you have to pass that token to every subsequent request so that your backend will say, yes, they're authenticated. This interceptor will allow you to pick that up every time and pass that along. You would add a header.
In the app that I work on at work, we have off guards that we write as services. Is that kind of Angular's implementation of that, I guess?
Possibly,
Okay.
yeah. Is there any other questions? Like I said, feel free to hit me up on anything. I know it kind of was a whirlwind. I was wanting to hit up some highlights. There's lots of good stuff that they've added in 2.0 plus 3, 4, 5, whatever you want to call it. So let me know if you have any questions, and I'll be happy to share. But thank you for your time.